Killing people who committed no crime is wrong, period. That's the basis of Christian belief. It's the basis of Western civilization. Dropping bombs on people who did nothing wrong is a crime, period.
So I came across this interview where Piers Morgan interviews Tucker Carlson, and to be honest, it really exposes Tucker Carlson's ignorance when it comes to the issue of Western civilization and what he perceives as the Eastern civilization, or in essence, what he's really talking about, Islam and Muslims. Look, I don't think Tucker Carlson isn't an intelligent person. He has come out critical of Israel and Zionist influence within America, but he has that thing that all of the political right have, that arrogance to believe Western civilization is some sort of peak civilization, unique in the world's history, and with his particular brand of conservatism believes that this development, this Western civilization, that unique civilization that was created, was a direct product or originated in Christianity. That means anything that isn't Western or built on Christianity is somehow seen as inferior. So although there's various topics he discusses in his interview with Piers Morgan, I want to take out just a couple of clips that exemplifies this ignorance that he has. It's an attempt to sort of rewrite history to make it look like the white Christian Europeans are civilized and the rest are just barbarians trying to tear down the gates of civilization. And it's important we understand this mentality, because some Muslims can be fooled into thinking that just because he's become a critic of Israel, that somehow that makes him an ally for Islam and the Muslims, or that Muslims should gather around and support him. The guy comes from a biased political spectrum that just happens to align on Israel with what some Muslims or many Muslims think. Anyways, let's just take a look at some of the clips.
Killing people who committed no crime is wrong. Period. That's the basis of Christian belief. It's the basis of Western civilization. Dropping bombs on people who did nothing wrong is a crime. Period. That is why we say we are better than the terrorists, because we don't kill people who did nothing wrong. And by definition, children haven't done anything wrong. So you are not allowed to kill them.
So a few things. Firstly, he claims the basis of Christian belief and the basis of Western civilization is that killing innocent people or people who haven't committed a crime is wrong. That's the basis of their belief system. That's the basis of Western civilization. How has he made this assessment though? Because historically and even to some extent theologically, that just simply is wrong. Before I explain why it's wrong, Tucker Carlson, Jordan Peterson, Candace Owens, even Nick Fuentes all have this fundamental idea that the Western civilization is peak civilization, it's the greatest civilization that's ever existed. That's their starting premise. If bad things happen, like even Tucker Carlson gives the example of nuking Hiroshima and Nagasaki as being wrong, these are exceptions to the norm. These aren't really what the West is about. Anyways, let's look at why he's wrong on this particular argument that the basis of the West and Christianity is, don't kill innocent people. Now, on Jake's channel, he's actually talked about and done a breakdown on this idea that Christianity is actually premised on the idea that an innocent man had to be killed to wash away the sins of the guilty. That's pretty important to the basis of Christianity. But also, if we find amongst Christian texts, and I'm talking about specifically the Old Testament, which Christians accept as revelation given by Jesus, that Jesus himself ordered the killing of men, women, children, and babies. Heck, even goats and donkeys too. And why do I say Jesus ordered it for them? Because from their perspective, from a Christian perspective, Jesus is a God. He's the God, the Son. So if God orders, that means according to them, Jesus also ordered this. So let's just look at 1 Samuel 15, where it states, "This is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." And there's other examples found in Christian texts like Numbers 21, 2-3, or Deuteronomy 20:17, and even Joshua 6:17 and Joshua 6:21. Even if he claims, well, this is the Old Testament and it's different now, the history of Christianity shows consistent, indiscriminate killing of the innocent with the so-called guilty. The crusades and the massacre of Jews in the Rhineland in 1096, the murdering and wholesale violence in 1099 in Jerusalem, targeting Muslims and Jews, including their women and children. In fact, the ransacking of Catholic Christians during the crusades, which in one form or another lasted for centuries, also murdered Christians of a different sect. I could talk about also Spanish Inquisition, 30 years religious war that ravaged Europe and forced conversions of Saxons by Charlemagne in the 8th century. This is my point. Whether from a theological or historical analysis, it's pretty clear that the claim Christianity doesn't advocate for violence against innocent peoples is just wrong. It's that revision of Christian history to give the impression that Europeans in the West generally are somehow more enlightened and civilized than others. In fact, even after the so-called Enlightenment period, where there was some sort of separation between church and state, the violence that they were perpetrating under Christendom spilled out in this period throughout the West and throughout the history of the West. Samuel Huntington makes this point most succinctly when he states the West won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, meaning Christianity, but rather by the superiority of applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do. And that's the point. Westerners like Tucker Carlson have forgotten this fact. It's like they've forgotten about colonialism that the West and European powers perpetrated, that enslaved and killed millions, that lasted for centuries, that we had carpet bombings of cities during World War II, that we saw Western states and only Western states, i.e. America, drop nuclear bombs on civilian centers, and that we saw the invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, and before that, Vietnam and Korea. America itself has spent 222 years at war of its 230 or so years of existence. That's a crazy stat. We also have examples of when America implemented sanctions against the Iraqi people that killed 500,000 children in Iraq. You know, innocent civilians. This was during the 1990s, and when Madeleine Albright was asked if that price was worth paying, the deaths of 500,000 children, she said, yes, it is a price worth paying. I could give you so many examples. I could give you the example that America ran drone strike program that said that any military-aged males who gathered in Afghanistan could be killed. They didn't have to check if they were guilty of any crimes or if they were innocent. They just assumed they were legitimate targets to murder. This is the same when it came to helicopters who gunned down Vietnamese in the 60s and 70s. Any military-aged males were seen as legitimate targets. So let's make it clear, Tucker. These are not aberrations, exceptions, and something unusual in the situation that goes against the general actions of the West. That's been the norm, like spreading smallpox in blankets to infect and kill Native American populations to ethnically cleanse them from the land. That's what America was built upon, these types of genocides and acts of ethnic cleansing. Anyways, I could keep going on, and I want to try and keep this as short as possible. He then goes on to make another incredibly ignorant point later on.
And in our system, the Western system, which is very distinct from the Eastern system, very distinct, and it's distinct on this one precise point, we believe and have always believed since this country was founded, since your country became not a pure monarchy, but even when it was a pure monarchy, the belief in the West, because of Christianity, was the worst thing you can do is punish the innocent. That's the worst thing you can do. That's worse than not punishing the guilty. And we often said that to each other.
So what does he mean by Eastern? I think we all generally know who he's referring to. He's referring generally to Islam and Muslims. And that's just pure demonization. The West is best and the East is barbarians. It's just pure ignorance as well. Before explaining what Islam states, let's just remind Tucker Carlson that Christianity didn't have this idea of innocent until proven guilty. You guys developed the idea, Christians developed the idea of trial by ordeal. It was a church-sanctioned idea. They believed you punish a person or subject him to an ordeal, and if they were innocent, God would cause some sort of miracle for that person to be saved from that punishment or ordeal. That's why they would drown suspected witches, believing if they sank, they must be innocent, but if they floated, then yeah, they're witches because only witches float. They burnt people suspected of crime, and if their wound didn't properly heal, they'd be judged guilty. These types of trials by ordeals lasted for centuries in Europe, and it seems that it was actually the influence of Islam and maybe some sanity that existed amongst some of them that realized that actually maybe we should move away from, torturing, drowning and burning innocent people to see whether they're guilty or not, or people who've been charged with a crime. Even the famed idea of Magna Carta, which is generally touted around in the West as the first constitution that restricted a leader's power, that stopped arbitrary arrest. Well, Forget the fact that this only applied to landowning class, you know, for the barons and the lords. Forget that this was born out of a rebellion in the 13th century where King John was forced into a compromise, but it was actually nullified. And nullified by who? By the Pope. The Pope believed it was a shameful text because it nullified the divine right of kings. So Tucker, that's your history, not mine. To then claim it's unique to the West, this idea that it's better for a, guilty man to go free rather than punishing an innocent person. Well, I've already explained how CIA signature drone strike program was implemented for years to target people they assumed to be guilty. They didn't actually have any proof that they were guilty. They were just men of a military age. Extrajudicial killings also included American citizens like Anwar al-Awlaki. This just underlines that they don't even hold on to this principle in the West. At the very best, they apply it in their own states, but when it comes to foreigners or abroad, those barbarians from the East, it's all fair game. There's no application of this idea of the rule of law. We can see this, what's happening in Gaza right now, that America itself supports. But what further just underlines how dumb his statement was when it comes to the issue that, this is unique to the West, is that any Muslim who knows any detail in Islam or Islamic jurisprudence knows that the maxim that was established by the Prophet ﷺ himself, that comes direct from his words from the hadith, that states, verily it is better for the leader to make a mistake in forgiving the criminal than it is for him to make a mistake in punishing the innocent. And this was understood by the scholars throughout our history. As the Suyuti writes, a principle of law states that legal punishments are suspended by doubts. Why? Because he's assumed to be innocent. So far from being a unique idea of the West, this idea that it's better for a guilty man to go free than an innocent man to be punished, and that everybody should be assumed to be innocent, this was established in Islam from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And to be honest, it's most likely that this principle that came to Europe actually came to Europe and the West through Islam and the Muslims. We know, for instance, that Harvard Law School has the very verses of the Quran inscribed on the entrance of its library from Surah Nisa verse 135, considered the greatest concept of justice found in any religious text. O you who believed, be persistent, standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it's against yourself or parents and relatives, whether one is rich or poor. Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not personal inclinations, lest you not be just. And if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, then indeed Allah is ever with what you do acquainted. In the interview, I'm not saying I disagree with everything Tucker Carlson states, but it's clear that he suffers from a blind spot when it comes to Islam and Muslims, when it comes to how he sees the Western Christianity. I sincerely believe these guys need to be educated and getting out of their tribal support for the Western Christianity, because in large part, Christianity and its rise is just that, about nationalism and tribalism. It's not about truth. It's not about knowing the facts. It's just an attempt to prop up the idea that America or the West is somehow the greatest civilization out there. If your life is crappy, if you see a rise in crime, if you see falls in living standards, if you see war and instability, breakdown of family values, well, that's not the fault of the West and its values, whether you believe it came from Christianity or not. But it's ultimately the fault of others, ultimately the fault of these foreigners. That's the narrative they want to push. And they want to push this idea that no matter how problems there are in the West, ultimately you've got it good and you shouldn't really complain. Otherwise, you might become one of those backward countries and adopt backward beliefs. But anyone who understands actually understands not just the history and the origins of Western civilization, but also the values of this civilization. It's these values that are self-contradictory, causing the problems themselves and allowing states, Western states, to perpetrate violence, including against the innocent. Anyways, these are just some thoughts. Inshallah, if you like this video, share it, comment on it, etc. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.